And one of the things that keeps showing up, and so I'll just, again, what I'll do is I'll place it in the center, is this question of religion. And so I actually took the time to write an article. One of the last medium pieces I wrote actually was on science and religion, in many ways motivated by an awareness that this was going to be part of the conversation. Because we're operating right now, particularly in the West, where there's a lot of loaded bias, a lot of loaded energy about the meaning of this concept, which most of which is just leftover conflict at the level of systems of justification. And the sort of the power dynamics associated with the struggle that occurred in history. Okay. Yep. But has very little to do with the thing we're trying to actually talk about. So part of what's going to happen in the scene of the fifth joint point is kind of like a standing up and dusting off, polishing and reconfiguring the thing oftentimes named religion, which is a thing. It's a part of something. And the way I would talk about it is something like, look, guys, if I imagine a wagon, right, and it's made out of like twigs and sticks gathered in the forest, lashed together with natural plant fibers. Right? So this is a rickety fucking wagon, okay? And then I brought this wagon in front of you and said, vehicle, and you had a Tesla next to it, you'd be like, no, that's a shitty vehicle. And I'm talking about vehicle. I'm not talking about wagon, right? So if you look at religion and you map that to an architecture, a manifestation in various forms of embodiment, dealing with the practicalities of human psychology and institutional development and awareness and maturity that emerged over 10,000 years, you're mistaking a wagon for vehicle. But when we're talking about, look, I got a problem. How do I move energy through space-time with effectiveness? Well, I'm going to need a vehicle. Cool. If I want to get through the fifth joint point, I'm going to need religion.
Totally. And I'll speak to somebody who gets raised as a new atheist and now is essentially religious, right? To be like, yes.
Yes. And then, and I can honor new atheism. It's okay.
Sure.
Yep.
I mean,
one of the things that fucked up religion was it identified imaginary thinking. It just didn't have a disambiguation between the thing that it was supposed to be doing and how it was supposed to do it, and the capacity to glue imaginal thinking. And, Zack, Tomasello's point is not random, right? And the capacity to actually use these structures and institutions to, in fact, engage in differential allocations of political and economic power. Yes, that happened, right? Things accumulate.
Yeah.
Fine. We're dust it off.
History did. Yeah. History did happen. And I think you're exactly right. I think one thing that generative anthropology might say about religion is that it's good anthropology, bad cosmology. Another thing that it will point out is the kind of fight between atheists and deists often kind of comes down to the question of, did man create God or did God create man? And you'll notice the kind of symmetrical claims, and it sort of wants to wrap them up and say, in some sense, it happened at the same time in this event. And it's hard to actually say who created what. I mean, we can inquire to that question, but you'll notice the kind of fearful symmetry of those two points. I think generative anthropology has a lot to say too about science and religion and the ways in which kind of the Enlightenment, in some sense, represents this kind of scapegoating we're still a part of those kind of religious institutions that, again, made a lot of great Enlightenment things possible and also kind of clouded a lot of our thinking around it, I think.
Yeah. So for anybody who happens to watch this, who comes in particular the background on theology, the approach that I will generally take is I will generally throw out the baby and the bathwater with the expectation that because the thing we're dealing with is simply present in the environment, that if we become capable of perceiving clearly, we will effectively recapitulate the most fundamental, the essential aspects in the moment. And that part of our challenge is actually building the competence to do so with clarity and precision now. Right? So there's something to be gained by being aware of and referencing what I might call like the tone or the harmonic frequency or the echo of all of the lineages that have rediscovered the thing we're talking about. And there's something to be lost in being lost in the artifacts of that process. Right? So our job is to be artists which is to say our job is principally to learn how to tune into the scene. Our job is to become capable of expressing through ourselves the creative principle that is the thing that we are speaking about and speaking on behalf of. And if we can do that with enough competence and strength, our artistry shall manifest something that those who are coming with different architectures will be like, yeah.
Totally. To me, one of the things that was coming to mind is sort of like, hey, religion is like this collective desire to get the right relation to is and ought. I mean, that's what it's trying to do at this most abstract. It's creating a religio that affords a particular, and if that is, we can then toss out baby and bathwater and let that return in a particular way. That resonates.
Yeah,
sure. It's worth noting too. I mean, we know of no kind of human social orders in existence that are not in their origin religious, right? I mean, every human society has a religious component, right? So something is going on with the nature of human and religion. Even the word religion, I believe, means, you know, relinking, right? And so there's all these kind of dimensions to unravel there. But I think this is kind of one of the really important open questions that hopefully gender anthropology can shine a light on.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start running. So one of the things that just popped in my head was I felt very strongly called, I guess about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I can't remember now, to write an essay on my Substack. It may have actually been the very first one that was almost like agreement zero for the thing that I'm calling civium, right? So my proposition of what the arc looks like that takes us through the join point. And agreement zero had to do specifically with the notion of the sacred. Right? So the intuition I had was that the very specific pivot point was you can't be part of, you're not yet capable of participating in this scene if you don't have a felt sense in yourself of what the meaning of the notion of sacred is. So if you don't have sacred profane as a distinction and can't begin to use that in some way, and I'm not talking about you don't have a architecture of dead objects that you can point to that somebody else told you are sacred. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that slot, that niche in your sense making, in your soul, is that a valid place? Is there a way for you to get there? Or are you still basically in the 19th century endeavoring to kind of cleanse the notion of the sacred and ended up at the end of the New Atheist period with nothing left, and nothing left but an animosity towards the concept? If that's where you are, you're kind of still behind the times, right? That's you're super 1950s, and we're way past the 50s. Like, that's not where we are. So maybe that's the point. You know, the proposition there is that seems like a very foundational moment.
Love it. And I would say, in terms of sort of when I'm thinking about sort of like religion and, well, what is it in a sort of a traditional sense? I'm going to go in my primate transcendent self. Okay. And what I mean by that, this is the stuff John and I talk about, where the egoic propositional drops out and you shift the grip on the self-world relation, you know, quasi through right hemisphere, but it's a fundamental perspectival participatory self-world gripping that then affords a different kind of ontonormativity that says, oh my gosh, that I am connected to something larger than myself that then matters in the world. And then that's is an orienting, you know, compass for the sacred through that. And then there's the egoic justifier, which is then trying to bring propositions to organize the sense making in relation to that. That's trying to say, well, if this is, and there is ought, and this is why there is an ought. And I think what the atheistic thing, or what got confused maybe in many of the original religions, is what do we mean by metaphor and what do we mean by concreteness? And then science comes along and slays the literal concrete versions of the Santa Claus versions and says victory, and then completely undermines the collective gaggle ideas of the mythos that then afford the way humans can get together and narrate the sacred in particular kinds of ways, and afford that balance between the intuitive, transcendent, and a propositional structure. And quite frankly, with the emergence of science, that does give us new ontological things to wrestle with, that then need to be re-updated into our propositional narrative of isness. And that's what I see the sort of the challenge as, at least at the analytic logos level.
Just to kind of metabolize and refine back, the place where you began, so the proposal that there's in fact, let's call it just two modes. And so you're talking about the fact that you and John, you talk about at the minimum two modes, one of which you identify with something like the egoic systems of justification. And the other, I'm not sure that you gave it a particular name, but the whole point of the other is that there's an otherness to it. That's more or less exactly what I'm pointing at. And so when I say, like, do you have room for the distinction, for the notion that the concept of the sacred has content? What I'm saying is, are you in this conversation from the point of view of the egoic mode, in which case the answer is going to be no, or this other mode, in which case the answer is going to be yes, and in a very and I don't know exactly necessarily what that means, but the simple answer is yes. I feel that there's something being called by this. Now, generative anthropology puts real content there, really beautiful anthropological content.
Yeah. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's a sense in which when I'm hearing that, it's almost this question of, are you coming in good faith? Right. In a couple dimensions there, right? And so the theological kind of always is under the surface in a way that we try to sort of banish it. I mean, there's a real sense, I think, in which too our world today has a kind of there's been a real desacralization, and yet it kind of pops up in all these certain ways. Jordan and I were joking the other day about sort of, if you capitalize certain letters and words, it does a strange thing to the text, right? It adds sacrality where people they want to banish sacrality. But there's a sense in which it's always right there. And so I think, just being aware of that and open to that is a much healthier relation than the kind of naively trying to sort of think you could totally banish the sacred. I mean, we could talk about the origin. There's a lot in generative anthropology even has to say about the origins of science itself and where science appears on the originary scene. And notably, it is effectively desacralization. I mean, I don't want to summarize it too quickly, but this distinction between sacred and the non-sacred is almost where science itself emerges. Yeah.